The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box. I'm Karen Cho with Juliana Tattlebaum in London and Sylvia Amaro in Munich. These are your headlines today.
U.S. officials prepare for talks with Russia while President Macron calls for an emergency summit in Paris. And the German Minister for Foreign Affairs tells CNBC Europe must make a stand.
This is a moment of truth. Everybody in the world has to decide whether you stand on the side of the free world or you stand on the side of those who fight against the free world.
Transatlantic ties are thrown into doubt after US Vice President JD Vance hits out at the continent in a controversial speech at the Munich Security Council.
What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America.
Candidates clash in a fiery four-way debate as Germany enters its final week of campaigning, with the mainstream party heads hitting out at the far-right Alternative for Germany. And Tencent shares climb to their highest level in over 3 years as the Chinese tech giant looks to integrate DeepSeek's AI model into one of its key apps.
Good morning. A huge focus on the geopolitics over the weekend. And is Europe just being petulant at this point, or does it have a genuine argument that it's being left out? Because don't forget, we've been at a stalemate for a while now, a number of years, and there's been no progress on any sort of a peace resolution. Trump picks up the phone to Putin. There's a phone call. And now we have some progress stepping towards a process that may unfold leading to a peaceful negotiation. Maybe being the big question. Is it so early on? Do we need to see some warmth in the relationship and some credits on the board first before the Europeans come into the mix would be my point? Or is Europe exactly right to say, look, we need to be here from the very start if we're talking about a peace negotiation?
Well, I think that's certainly a good point. I think the other question here is to what extent JD Vance was trying to be provocative with those comments that we're going to dive into in just a moment. But JD Vance capturing the attention of the world on Friday when instead of putting the focus on Ukraine, he actually put the focus on Europe, saying that Europe's biggest threat is Europe itself. And was that being provocative? Was he just trying to get a response out of Europe, or does it signal an actual major policy shift from the US?
It's a real Trump playbook tactic, isn't it? You've got a big issue unfolding over here, throw a few grenades over here, and suddenly everybody is tortured over what they're meant to do on strategy, and I think we certainly saw that from the German position. Well, the latest, US officials will meet Russian representatives in coming days in Saudi Arabia to begin negotiations towards a Russia-Ukraine peace deal. US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff are due to travel to Saudi Arabia alongside Secretary of State Marco Rubio. An aide close to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky told NBC that Ukraine had not been invited to join the meeting, but President Trump told reporters on Sunday that Zelensky would be involved in conversations about peace. A number of European leaders will meet in Paris later today to discuss the situation in Ukraine after an invitation from President Macron. The Elysee said that leaders will discuss the US administration's approach to Ukraine as well as security concerns in Europe. Prime Minister Keir Starmer says the UK is ready to contribute to security guarantees for Ukraine through putting British troops on the ground. In an article for The Telegraph, Starmer said the UK can play a unique role in helping Europe and the US work together and called on European countries to do more to meet security demands. Well, the flurry of weekend activity came after US Vice President JD Vance used a speech at the Munich Security Conference to blast European countries, criticising politicians across the continent on issues including free speech, security and migration.
The Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine. And we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense. The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Ukraine and Europe would be part of any, quote, real negotiations over the Russia-Ukraine war. Speaking to CBS, Rubio said conversations had not yet reached that point and that the U.S. wanted to see if President Putin was serious about wanting peace. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, meanwhile, told NBC's Meet the Press that Ukraine would have to be involved in any discussions.
I will never accept any decisions between the United States and Russia about Ukraine. Never. And our people, never. And our adults and children and everybody. It can't be so. This is the war in Ukraine against us, and it's our human losses. And we are thankful for all the support, unity between USA, in USA, around Ukraine support, bipartisan unity, bipartisan support. We are thankful for all of this, but there is no any leader in the world who can really make a deal with Putin without us, about us.
Sylvia joins us now from the Munich Security Conference. And Sylvia, you've been so busy all weekend talking to leaders in Munich, and there's so many things to discuss here. Let me kick off with the response to JD Vance's really headline-grabbing address that we heard at the start of the weekend. I think he surprised many. Instead of focusing on Ukraine, he actually chose to focus on Europe and highlight what he sees as problems within, internal issues in Europe, which he said are the biggest threat to the bloc. Sylvia, what has been the response from leaders on the ground? Do they generally see this as provocative, headline-grabbing rhetoric from the U.S., or does this actually signal a major policy shift from the administration?
A bit of both, to be honest, Juliana, but all in all, the first reaction was basically shock, because the Munich Security Conference has historically been a place where the transatlantic relationship has been front and center, American and European lawmakers coming together, trying to figure out how to keep the world safe. But this time around, we heard JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, basically attacking European democracy, saying that governments do not let people think freely. And of course, Europeans have a problem with that. But beyond that, beyond the speech from JD Vance, Europeans have a problem with this shift in policy from the United States. In the words of the Finnish president, this is a wake-up call to the Europeans. They need to do more on defense, on security, and they can no longer rely on the United States for this. So when you look at what happened over the weekend, there's an existential threat here for the Europeans. Two participants told me yesterday that what we're witnessing right now is bigger than the Greek crisis, bigger than Brexit, and bigger than the COVID pandemic as well, because it is challenging the foundations of the European continent. They believe in the rule of law. They believe in multilateralism, in international institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the WHO as well. And all of that is in question right now. Here's the assessment from the German Minister of Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock.
There won't be any lasting peace if it's not a European agreed peace. I want to be crystal clear. This is a moment of truth. Everybody in the world has to decide whether you stand on the side of the free world or you stand on the side of those who fight against the free world. And we are standing here on the side of the free world.
So one of the conclusions is that Europeans need to do more on defense. They need to spend more on defense, and they need to do more for Ukraine. Here's what the Foreign Secretary for the UK, David Lammy, told me on Saturday about what the Europeans can do, and really that they have to step up their support for Ukraine as well.
If we look at GDP combined, it's about 0.01% that we are spending on that fight for Ukraine. We know this is the front line, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe. We know, too, that even when we get to a negotiated peace, Putin will not go away. So this is an existential question for Europe. We meet that question alongside the United States. At an appropriate time, we will get into a debate about security guarantees. And there will be an arrangement, of course, but quite rightly, we say that there is an irreversible pathway for Ukraine towards NATO. That is the cheapest and it is the best mechanism to secure peace, not just in Europe, but across the Euro-Atlantic.
So there's a realization that Europeans, the continent, needs to do more for themselves and also for Ukraine. And one of the question marks really is, what can European governments do for Ukraine? What sort of security guarantees can they give to Kyiv? Here's the Polish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Sikorski, making the point that it's not just about talking and saying things, that the Europeans need to give security guarantees to Ukraine that are not empty because they have made that mistake in the past.
Ukraine already has guarantees that have proven to be empty. Ukraine gave up what was at the time the third largest nuclear arsenal to Russia in return for Russia's guarantees of inviolability of borders, and they were joined by the US, UK, France, and China, and yet have not been acted upon. What you're suggesting is that we give a guarantee when Russia invades. What do you mean by that? Does that mean we then go to war with Russia? Because that is what it has to mean if it is to be credible.
So Minister Sikorski there was addressing one of the schools of thought that we witnessed over the weekend here in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. Some US lawmakers were suggesting that perhaps one way to look at this, one way to give security guarantees to Ukraine was to say, if Russia were to invade Ukraine a third time, then Ukraine would immediately access NATO. It would become an immediate member of the defense alliance. But for Minister Sikorski, that's not good enough. We need other security guarantees now. We cannot wait for a potential third invasion. When we take a step back now, all eyes today are on the meeting happening in Paris, the emergency meeting called by the French President Macron. Several leaders, including from Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, Spain, Netherlands, and Denmark, will be present in Paris later today. Let's see whether they will have any sort of concrete outcomes in terms of potential security guarantees. What are the Europeans doing in this context as their whole system is being challenged at this stage? Let's see whether they will have any sort of comment later today. But this is likely to be just the first of many meetings over the coming weeks on the European continent. And let's not forget as well that the British Prime Minister is trying to be the bridge here between the United States and the Europeans too. So a lot to monitor, but no doubt that this is a very pivotal moment in the geopolitical scene, guys.
Sylvia, I want to pick up on that point. As Macron convenes an emergency meeting, it feels as though he's looking at what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And in Saudi, we've got the US Middle East envoy, Witkoff. We've got the National Security Advisor, Waltz, and the US Secretary of State just happens to be in the region as well. The Americans are going to be meeting in Saudi and try to cut a deal with the Russians, at least progress the conversation from the initial phone call between Putin and Trump. Are the Europeans being too sensitive, saying, look, we're not invited to that meeting, we're not there present, but we'll have our own meeting just in case on the sidelines? Are they being too sensitive about the progress the Americans are trying to make here?
Well, the Europeans have to come together. They have to realize what they can do to have some sort of say in these conversations, because right now they are not having a say. They are not at that table. We have the French president calling Saudi Arabia saying, please, can you make sure that some of our thoughts, our wants are taken into consideration? They are not there. They cannot have a direct say in these conversations. So from a European perspective, they are trying to come together to come up with a plan so they are ready for whatever comes from those conversations between the United States and Russia in Saudi Arabia. But for the time being, what we're witnessing is them to some extent, being quite desperate, trying to make sure that they will have a say. This is also important from a Ukrainian perspective. First and foremost, if you think about what President Zelensky said here over the weekend, they cannot have peace conversations without Ukraine. Ukraine is also not at the table right now, and President Zelensky made it very clear that he's only going to talk to one Russian person, and that is the president, Vladimir Putin. He's not going to discuss any sort of peace discussions with other Russian officials. He wants to have those conversations directly with Putin, and President Zelensky also made the comment that Putin has lied in the past, and therefore President Trump should also be very careful when having conversations with Putin. So there's a lot at stake here. Let's see how all of these meetings will pan out, what will be the conversations, but no doubt a lot of pressure right now on the EU, on the UK, and of course on Ukraine as well.
Sylvia, terrific coverage. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. And you can find out more from our coverage of the Munich Security Conference, including Sylvia's conversation with the EU's foreign policy chief. That's on CNBC.com. The four main candidates vying to become the next Chancellor of Germany clashed in a televised debate Sunday night, exchanging barbs on everything from Ukraine to illegal immigration and the country's deepening economic woes. Incumbent Chancellor Olaf Scholz defended his party after US Vice President JD Vance delivered a scathing attack on European leaders, accusing them of censoring free speech and sidelining far-right party views. Vance met with AfD leader Alice Weidel on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, snubbing Scholz. Now, with just 7 days to go before voters head to the polls, right-wing opposition parties are leading the polls, with Friedrich Merz's conservative Christian Democrats at around 30%, and Weidel's far-right Alternative for Germany at around 20%.
Coming up on the show, back in business, Chinese President Xi Jinping cozies up with tech tycoons as Beijing looks to boost investor confidence in the private sector. Plus, Berkshire Hathaway makes billions after dumping its holdings of two key U.S. banks. We'll tell you where the Oracle of Omaha is putting his money to work. And unlocking Europe's AI potential. We'll drill down into the digital decade with the Vice President to EMEA of Amazon Web Services. That conversation is coming up at 7:30 GMT. Welcome back to Squawk Box. Let's get a check on the market action. We on Friday saw mixed trade stateside. You can see beside me the Nasdaq closed higher by about 0.4%. The S&P and the Dow, though, ending slightly below the flat line. For the week overall, though, was a positive one for Wall Street, led by tech stocks. The tech-heavy Nasdaq gained about 2.6% for the week. That was the best weekly performance since June last year. So after the DeepSeek saga, we have seen investors put money back to work in the tech sector. Not quite as rosy for the Dow. That ended up about 0.5%. The S&P somewhere in the middle, gaining about 1.5% for the week overall. In terms of action in bond markets, here's where we sit right now in treasuries. You've got yields lower across the board. The 10-year trading around 4.478%, so just below the 4.5% mark. The 2-year around 4.26% heading into the week, where we're going to get FOMC minutes. We're going to hear from some Fed officials this week and also get some key U.S. housing market data. So a lot on the macro front to look forward to in the days ahead. In terms of dollar crosses, last week the dollar index lost more than 1%. It was the fourth negative week in the last 5 for the dollar. So that's been an interesting trade. We've seen a lot of that dollar strength unwinding. Now this morning, euro and sterling both holding steady versus the greenback. Dollar yen trading weaker this morning, and dollar Swissy trading slightly firmer. Now on to the Asian trade. How are things looking over in the Asian region? Well, you've got red on the board for the Hang Seng. It's pulled back about 1/3% after what was a really strong rally for Hong Kong listed Chinese tech stocks at the end of last week. We're going to be talking a lot more about what's been going on to drive those stocks higher a little bit later in the program. This morning, though, fairly steady trade. Shanghai Composite also looking fairly steady at this point, and the Kospi over in South Korea up about 0.6%. For more insights and analysis into what could drive European equities today, would encourage you to check out our live market blog on CNBC.com.
UK Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds said US tariffs on UK steel would be negative for both countries in an interview with the BBC. He added that the UK has had some constructive conversations with the Trump administration and stressed Britain's unique relationship with the US compared to the EU or China. France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has told Sylvia at the Munich Security Conference that tariffs against the EU could trigger retaliation.
No one around the globe should consider entering into a trade war with Europe and with the EU, because there is so much to lose. In fact, the US themselves, last time they started a trade war, mostly against China, but we got our share of this trade war, they basically lost. They got hurt more than they hurt the people that they were targeting with that trade war. So everyone should think twice before waging a trade war with the EU and, in fact, with the rest of the world. If the EU is the subject of the trade war, wherever it may come from, the EU will retaliate. We've done it in the past, we'll do it again. We'll defend our interests. In fact, we've built up some very powerful instruments that should deter anyone from waging a trade war, and if this deterrence is not enough, then we will retaliate if our interests are at stake.
Our next guest says the macro effects of U.S. tariffs are overwhelmingly negative, including slower GDP growth, higher unemployment, and inflation. Satyam Pandey joins us now, Chief U.S. and Canada Economist at S&P Global Ratings. Satyam, thank you so much for being with us this morning. You've done a lot of analysis around the impact of these potential tariffs and the tariffs that have been announced and imposed, including looking at some what-if scenarios for Europe. So let's start there. Talk to us about what Europe stands to lose if it gets into a tariff war with the U.S.
Well, it's not just Europe, right? It's both the U.S. and Europe and the rest of the world. In fact, it's just a no-win situation for anybody. The risk here is the tit-for-tat retaliation just leads to the whole trading system slowing down. Everybody is looking at a higher cost, investment spending slowing down with the uncertainty, and it just isn't a good environment for anyone.
Well, Satyam, in terms of where things could go next with Europe and the U.S., Europe has said that they will respond firmly and immediately to these reciprocal tariffs should they come into effect. How are you modeling this? What are your assumptions around where the direction of travel for these back and forth tariffs between the EU and the US?
Well, the latest in the tariff world is that the Trump administration is reviewing some of the reciprocal tariffs. So if you have a higher tariff rate on certain products than what the US is charging on your imports, the U.S. is going to step up and, make the equal tariff rates for that. So in that sense, there are, the auto sector, for example, the European Union has about 10% tariff on the U.S. autos, while the U.S. has only 2.5%. So the U.S. is going to increase to 10%. So that would have an impact. So those kinds of products, there are thousands of products that have these differences in tariffs, which are being looked upon right now. And in the next 6 weeks to 8 weeks, we will find out more.
Satyam, the USMCA was negotiated by Trump, and there is a sunset clause, or there's a clause in here embedded that would see any renegotiation or review of this pact before July next year. But many are now wondering whether Trump wants to renegotiate this entire pact altogether. What do you think he's attempting to do here? Is that the case?
Well, one could imagine that this is going to be pulled forward. Maybe we won't be waiting till July of next year. Instead, the negotiation talks will probably start by the end of this year. And until then, this is not just about the USMCA itself, but there are some other policy objectives that the Trump administration have, especially when you consider USMCA regional bloc. You can think of the immigration, the narcotics, all that border control related policy objectives are also being brought in. So in order to get these other policy objectives, they are using tariffs as a negotiating ploy.
Satya, we can certainly see that the net has been cast a lot wider than simply trade policy. But the reality is trade policy has been upended first time by the Trump administration and carried forward with the Biden administration. That China plus one strategy has meant that goods have been rerouted, and we've seen supply chains geared towards Canada and Mexico. I mean, semiconductors are a great example, autos as well. If we see specifically that the clause in the USMCA that 75% of components in a vehicle must be produced in North America, if that's renegotiated, could that be raised or altered, which would have dramatic consequences for the pricing structure or even more production in the United States?
Well, that is one of the main issues, that the Trump administration wants to address. The import content of whatever is happening within the region has to be much higher than the 75%. And, I'm sure they will sort of negotiate it towards the upwards of 85% or so. But at the end of the day, your question is bringing back the industrial production, the jobs. At the end of the day, it's not just about the tariffs and the import content. You have to look at other competitive aspects of the whole production, right? Labor, especially the labor cost itself. When you look at the Mexican unit labor cost versus the American unit labor cost, there's quite a bit of wide margin of difference. So it still probably would be Mexico where things would be still more competitively produced than the US. So all of these, depending on how the tariffs are structured, how much of this supply shifting happens from one country to another, it really matters. And we are sort of in a place where still things are uncertain. Things are still being reviewed. So it's hard to front run all of this.
Well, Satyam, let's try to dive then into a little bit more detail on what we do know around the steel and aluminium tariffs that are due to come into effect mid-March. How do you think about the direct impact of these tariffs on the consumer in the U.S.? What impact will it have on prices and GDP? And what sectors should we be thinking about from a knock-on perspective?
So with the steel and aluminum, specifically the 25% tariffs that have been sort of put in place, the direct impact in the U.S. economy itself is going to be very small. This is a very small share of the overall $29 trillion nominal GDP of the U.S. It will give some reprieve to the steel industry where they're not, they could possibly add to some of the utilization of their capacity right now. In case of the aluminum, they just don't have any capacity to increase without spending, doing more investment spending for future production. On top of that, if you really think about it, on the steel side, yes, there is some natural resource endowment to make steel like iron ore in the US, but in the aluminum, we just don't have that comparative advantage where a third of the production is based on electricity generation. And we don't have that here in the US in order to step in immediately. So there is going to be a hit. But a lot of it, again, it's going to be shown in the prices. Prices will move up. The knock-on effect is obviously going to be the downstream users of steel and aluminum, especially when you think of the construction sector. Auto sector would be a big one. And then you'll have these regular packaging sectors, right? The cans, beer industry probably is going to have to bear some of that cost. So a lot of the knock-on effect on the downstream industries.
Thank you for listening to Squawk Box Europe Express.
For more market-moving news, you can head to cnbc.com.
Or join us again on the show with Steve Sedgwick, Karen Cho, and myself, Arabile Kumete, weekdays on CNBC.